So we're going to start the new session of the public safety meeting. Madam Chair, would you please call the roll?
Alderman Boyd,
Present.
Alderwoman Davis, Alderwoman Howard, Alderwoman Spencer, Alderwoman Boyd,
Present.
Alderman Bosley, Alderman Muhammad, Alderman Oldenburg,
Here.
Alderman Narayan,
Here.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard,
Here.
Alderman Page,
Present.
Chairman Vaccaro.
Present.
7 present, you have quorum.
Okay, well, let's start by the, want to get the approval of the minutes from the March 16th committee meeting? March 16th, 2022. Do we have?
I move for approval of the minutes, March 16, 2022.
Second.
Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Boyd,
Aye.
Alderwoman Davis, Alderwoman Howard, Alderwoman Spencer, Alderwoman Boyd,
Here.
Alderwoman Boyd, it's an aye.
Alderman Bosley,
You got all confused.
Alderman Muhammad, Alderman Oldenburg,
Aye.
Alderman Narayan,
Aye.
Alderwoman Clark Hubbard,
Aye.
Alderman Page,
Aye.
Chairman Vaccaro.
Aye.
7 aye votes.
Okay, it's new. We're just coming off break, so a few glitches there. So there won't be any votes, but we do, I apologize for that. We do have the two of the folks from the Center for Political Equality, and they're going to kind of go through their presentation, and then we'll be just open to whoever on the committee would like to ask questions. So if Doctor and Doctor, you can pick which one you want to start the presentation, share your screen. We kind of saw the presentation and a lot of us already have it, but this is a good opportunity to kind of see what we think about and how we move forward in public safety over the next year. So Doctor or Doctor, whoever wants to, please introduce yourself and jump in.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman Vaccaro. So I'd love to get started. I'll introduce myself. I'll let Rob introduce himself, and then we'll get into the presentation. Thank you for having us into your space today, and thank you for agreeing to hear from us. My name is Hans Manos. I'm the Vice President of the Triage Response Team here at the Center for Police and Equity. The Center for Police and Equity, or CPE as we call it, has been focused on efforts around the country to reimagine public safety. That's one of the main goals of the Triage Response Team. Prior to coming to TRT, to CPE, I was the executive director of the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, which is the oversight agency for the Philadelphia Police Department. And prior to that, held several roles in both juvenile justice and victim services. I'm a social worker by training and by education, and I'm really excited to talk to you about all those experiences and how they inform some of our work and how CPE informs some of this work. But before we do that, I'll let Rob introduce himself.
Hi, y'all. I want to say thank you again for having us in your space. My name is Rob Kenter. I'm the Senior Director of the Triage Response Team. And actually, my background is in policing. I spent almost 31 years with the Norfolk Police Department here in coastal Virginia, and that's where I'm calling from today. And 26 of those years, I was actually a street cop, right? So I identify as a street cop with a PhD. I've been in this policing space for a very long time, and I'm very aware of the systems and the nuances and the language and what goes on out there. My academic background is in public administration, actually. And I look at state decision-making as a means of social control. Primarily a South, non-South comparison is my sweet spot. I just want to say thank you again for letting us be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Rob. So if it's all right, I will go ahead and share my screen, make sure that works today. Sometimes it's a bit wonky. Can everyone see the screen? I think that's a yes. from
Yes.
everybody.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to say this, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end, or whatever works for you all. So again, who we are, the Center for Police and Equity, we're a nonprofit organization and we're powered by science. So we believe that we can use data and science as a lever for social change. However, we also seek to center communities in all of our work, and a lot of that is represented in the presentation today. So, we use the phrase reimagining public safety, but I think it's important to highlight what we mean when we say that. The idea that public safety is more than just policing, and it refers to how governments ensure residents are safe, and what it means to reimagine that, right? We need to understand, is the public safe? Are there injustices present in this current system? And from there, we can make a lot of decisions and do a lot more assessment. For us, there's really two processes that need to happen simultaneously if we're going to reimagine public safety. Any effort, especially large efforts, don't happen overnight. So we need to focus on improving the systems that we have while we build the systems that we need. So the harm reduction work that you'll see that is represented in our policy recommendations and improvements to the police department, those are those efforts to improve the systems that we have. The recommendations that we have around a different responder or a different point of view on public safety or a different way to democratize data, those are building new systems that we need. A cornerstone of our work was understanding the community perspectives. For CPE or for any group, it's important to understand how the people who are most impacted are perceiving the problem. It's a great starting point, and it was really great for us to understand, and it really informed our recommendations. However, as folks who represent the community, most of these are not going to be news to you. So I'll go through them pretty quickly. There was a sense that there's an inequity between North and South St. Louis that bore out in a couple of other data points outside of community perspectives as well. There was a desire for increased investment in alternative response models. Some of these already exist in the city, and there's some desire for even more investment in the existing systems that are being stood up over the last year, and of course other kinds of responders as well. There was a general sense that the education system and other opportunities for young people should be improved, and that there was not enough of those. We appreciate that perspective by community because it really does speak to a larger and more inclusive idea of what public safety is, and not purely a response, but sometimes a punitive upstream assessment of what we can do. And of course, a desire for more robust accountability mechanism, that people just felt like the current existing COB didn't lack the sufficient resources to do the job that the residents wanted to be doing. The community, as you all know, referenced the idea of general safety while in traffic and while otherwise engaging in movement throughout the streets, whether that's as a pedestrian or as a driver, that they felt it was unsafe to be a driver or in the streets of St. Louis based on accident prevention. And more broadly, the residents of the city highlighted that they felt there wasn't enough community engagement from not only the police department, but from the mayor's office, from other city government, and that community engagement wasn't purposeful enough to really draw people in. In other words, there wasn't community engagement that went to them where they were already gathering, and often community engagement looked like people being called in or brought in, and otherwise not enough information about what is happening, what is being done in the city. So that was a quick run through about some of the community engagement efforts. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kenter, who can take it from here, and I'll be back in a little bit.
So as part of our work with CP, we like to say we're data-driven, that we use the data to make decisions. So we took a kind of a hard look at the calls for service that the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department receives, and we did some multi-level modeling of those calls for service. And there was some pretty stark outputs from that modeling. However, I'm sure none of this is new to y'all who live in the city, but that northern section of the city had quite a bit more use of force. They had more calls for service. They had slower times to dispatch. In a nutshell, that people in the northern half of the city receive a less responsive police services. Next slide, please, Hans. We also looked at use of force And we did a little breakdown of what were those calls to service that ended in the use of force. And what we found, if you see the highlights in red, those are officer initiated calls for service, as opposed to in blue is when the police received a 911 call and then responded. So a great deal of the use of force in the northern half of the city is on officer initiated, and preventative is low level calls, a suspicious person. So that tells a pretty good story that these low level interactions are resulting in use of force by the police department. Next slide, please, Hans. We also found some disparities within the police districts. And like I spoke about earlier, longer response times, longer average time on the messages, and what may be seen as a lower priority call in the southern half of the city. Officers oftentimes raise that priority level for the same type of call in the northern half of the city. Next slide. So really, to get to what the St. Louis Police Department is doing, we consulted with the Matrix Consulting Group to do a workload and staffing analysis. Now, there's not a whole lot of people that actually do this work. It's very nuanced. And we have found that this group, this family-owned company, does a really good job, probably the best job of anyone out there. And some of the key findings from that was there are significant opportunities to reduce the workload of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department by handing off some of those low-risk calls for service to unarmed civilian responders. Also, there's imbalances in staffing based on the workload, in that the northern half of the city has a much higher workload. However, they have the same amount of officers as the other patrol districts, which creates a great deal of risks. Situational risk is what we call them, for less than responsive policing and risk for bias. Next slide, please, Hans. So by diverting these low risk calls for service, there's two benefits to that. It reduces the footprint of policing and reduces the interaction between the police and the residents. And it frees up the patrol officers' time, actually. In this day and age where most major cities are having trouble with the actual human capacity in their police department to answer calls for service, and vacancies grow, this will allow a reduced workload for that reduced human capacity in the police department. Next slide. So, based on the work that Matrix Consulting Group has done, what they see other cities doing, they identified 19 call types that represented 18% of the workload that could be diverted to the civilian unarmed responders. And these are low risk calls for service. And it'll free up the actual police department's time to respond to what you want them to do, to make strong community engagement, stronger connections, and really respond to violent crime, because there is a great deal of concern about community violence that we found from the community members themselves. Next slide, Hans. So here's an example of the workload differences. And I think this chart really, so this chart represents by time of day how much unencumbered time on the top officers have in the 3rd patrol district versus the 4th patrol district. So as you can see, at the time of the highest workload, between 11 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock at night, your officers in the 4th patrol, the 4th district, they don't even have time to grab a sandwich or go to the bathroom. Right? That shift, they go from call to call to call. Calls get stacked, as we call it, right? So when you start your shift, there's already 15 calls for service waiting. That's just an example. And the officers they don't have the time to be really responsive to the needs of the community because of that inequity, right? You have equality in staff, but it's not equitable across districts. And we find that to be a huge risk for biased policing, right? People have less patience when they're rushed. So that, I think that this chart to me is a great example of that issue. Next slide, Hans. And back to you, Hans. Thank you very much, y'all.
Thank you, Rob, for running us through that. I appreciate it. A lot to unpack there.
Hans, before you go, let me just emphasize, we're not recommending that you increase the size of the St. Louis Police Department. What CPE is recommending is that you use the resources you have in a better way and put the right respondents to the right calls for service. You have the Cops and Clinicians program, which is extremely successful. And by creating this unarmed responders, you can increase the efficacy of the police department without increasing their size, just by taking some of their workload away. I'm sorry, Hans, go ahead. I just wanted to emphasize that we're not recommending increasing the size of the police department.
No, thank you, Rob. Very important. And yeah, and that analysis really, it undergirds both buckets, right? The general idea that we need to improve systems we have and build systems that we need. So that analysis is really used to kind of support both of those types of recommendations. Speaking of improving systems that we have, the policy review process. We received a lot of requests from the city focused on use of force, pedestrian and vehicle stops, and crisis intervention. The goal of our review was to identify opportunities to reduce risk of disparities and harm. And the guiding principles, as Rob mentioned, behavior is more strongly affected by situations and policies than by individual attitudes, and that restrictive police policies are associated with lower rates of force and more equitable outcomes. So here's some recommendations on transparency and accountability. The St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department's policies are not easily accessible to the public. We recommend that they adopt a unified system to restore and update those policies, publicly share all of those operations, and share any updated policies as they're created. There's a general lack of community confidence in existing civilian oversight. I referenced that earlier. I recognize that this is an ongoing conversation throughout the city. Some advocacy groups and probably some folks in the Board of Aldermen are focused on this. But the general recommendation is to convene a planning group to follow up on these concerns and really investigate whether or not the board could be improved. Vehicle and pedestrian stops. There are ongoing disparities that are represented in the SLMPD pedestrian stops and vehicle stops. This is an analysis that we've done for you all for the city of St. Louis twice, including a report that we listed in September, that we not listed, made public in September. Some of the recommendations to address some of these issues are the end of pretextual stops. That's via policy, and prohibit stops basically on low-level equipment and registration violations. I understand that's a conversation based on other aspects about safety on the streets, and prohibit officers from asking questions unrelated to original stop reasons. A lack of uniform data collection and analysis on SLMPD stops. In general, we recommend that they improve the data collection and the analysis of the pedestrian stops, and ensure and enhance the procedures for routine analysis of staff data. And the procedures are all there. In addition to disparities in stops, there's also disparities in use of force. As we looked at the use of force policy, there's opportunities to improve here. There's an update to the general use of force policy, clarify and expand the SLMPD policy language on neck restraints and positional asphyxia, and to update the SLMPD policy language on tasers and OC spray. Those are three fairly simple things that the SLMPD could do to improve or constrain, I should say, a use of force in the city. Need for improved policies and systems to facilitate effective response to mental health incidents. As we mentioned, our team has been working with the city on its mental health response policies. The crisis intervention team, as well as the crew teams, are folks that we've been working with. And the idea for us is that we continue that work to improve the crisis intervention team and support dispatch of alternative and specialized response systems, including a new CAD system or computer-aided dispatch system, and an effort to inform callers of the other things available to them when they dial 911. Finally, body-worn cameras. The body-worn camera are not utilized as a proactive and accountability tool. For folks who were present or involved in the conversation, even peripherally, about what body-worn cameras were designed to do, they were designed to be an accountability tool to make sure that officers' behavior was visible and accountable to public review. That is not how it has been utilized, not only in St. Louis, but around the country. So we recommend a more thoughtful effort to utilize footage as a training tool, a rubric to grade officers' interactions on procedural justice, and an effort to publish the identified results of any of these audits focused on procedural justice that should be done by both supervisors and a more central unit. So we mentioned the crew teams, and Rob mentioned that 18% of calls that could be addressed. We recommend a civilian responder that begins to take on some of that 18% of calls that police are taking, but we do not need a person with a badge and a gun to be responding to. That new CSO or community service officer should certainly handle those low-risk calls and should ideally be housed outside of SLMPD and not be armed. We recommend adding 15 CSOs, at least to start, and to deploy that to positions on patrol day afternoon watches where the high call volume is the highest. Again, as Rob mentioned, there is an issue as it related to staffing. And so the recommendation is to align staffing and workload in order to address some of those inequities that we're seeing. The example that we had on the slide was 2 districts that are staffed equally or flatly, but have 2 different sets of needs. And as a result, some districts are really, at some point, some residents are not getting any response. And the effort should be to ensure that they do. So aligning that staffing and the workload should address some of these issues, and that reallocation should help to alleviate the overall burden for some community members. Acoustic gunshot detection. In our review of existing literature, frankly, in St. Louis, there was a conversation about acoustic gunshot detection and its usefulness as a patrol response. As highlighted, there's a lot of strains on patrol. One of those is this response to acoustic gunshot that doesn't necessarily, in the majority of those calls, lead to any action by that patrol officer. In conversations with the SLMPD, we learned that this is possibly a useful and powerful investigative tool. We encourage them and encourage counsel in an oversight role to ask them about how they can establish how useful it is as a tool, but recommend that in the short term, it's been established that it is not necessarily a useful tool for patrol, and they reconsider a patrol response while continuing to allow an investigative response in terms of evidence gathering by using this tool. But we also recommend that they inform communities regarding where where those sensors are and how they're being utilized. Recommendations on intimate partner violence and family violence. Responses to IPV and family violence are led by the police right now, and the frontline assessments of various types of family violence are conflated, and the follow-up services are limited. So we recommend establishing a more robust, holistic response to IPV and family violence, investigating partnerships with hospital-based and childhood trauma teams to respond to children who are vicarious victims, ensuring appropriate responses that separate family violence from intimate partner violence and ensure that we're having the right responder. And a long-term kind of big, bold goal is the investigation of a family justice center. We recognize that one had existed for a short period in St. Louis in the past, around 2006. We look to understand why that was not successful and what can be learned from that. As I referenced, community engagement is a central concern for residents of the city. So there's a lack of coordinated and strategic community engagement by the city of St. Louis and the SLMPD. We recommend creating and publicly distributing a community engagement strategy that really ensures that there's evaluation and focuses on the most vulnerable people in the city, specifically racial minorities and low-income communities, and a greater focus on community engagement in the groups in the spaces that they already operate. Again, going to people instead of asking people to come to events. Opportunities for young people. There is according to residents, and I think there's a large agreement here, that there's a lack of accessible and affordable programming that ensures children have safe, supervised place during out of school time. So the city should, and the city I believe shouldn't and is expand and fund after school and summer programs. That means investing in new and after school programs and ensuring the programs are accessible, ensuring that families are aware of the opportunities, and evaluating and measuring the long-term impacts of these investments on multiple outcomes, including public safety. And finally, we recommend a public safety collaborative that is powered by RTMDX software, in other words, that utilizes risk terrain modeling to inform the public safety collaborative. This is born of the idea that there's an unfulfilled desire to shrink the footprint of policing and to ensure that everyone who can play a role in public safety is able to do so. The Public Safety Collaborative would empower all the stakeholders to do what they do best when they're needed. The collaborative would be powered by software that helps them identify opportunities for crime and disorder and offers stakeholders the opportunity to proactively disrupt that and without a uniform reliance on police, without always dispatching police to solve these problems. It synthesizes existing data that already exists and is accessible to your city. And as I noted, it would transfer the control of data and democratize decision-making so that all stakeholders, not just police, have a role in this. This is something that's being done around the country, and I'm happy to have conversations when we have more time about what this could look like and offer some examples. Are there any questions?
Let me get my sound and my camera back on. You want to go and take away the shared screen? So
Yep, I will work on that now. If only I could figure out how to do that.
I think what we'll do, I think we're gonna go straight down the list of as soon as he takes that away, unless Vice Chairman Boyd, do you want the screen to stay up there? In
No,
case you want to refer to
I
anything?
don't.
Okay, so we're gonna go right down the list. We're gonna start, and Alderman Page, I see your hand. We're gonna go straight down the list, and because I'm sure we all have a lot of questions. Plus, I've already set up a meeting for next week. I asked the clerk, I'd like to have the police chief and Director Isom in, into our next meeting, because as we start to try to work through all this. So Vice Chairman Boyd, you're up first.
Is the screen still being shared?
No, we're good now.
Oh, good. Okay, I couldn't figure out how to enter share screen. Got it.
You did it, you got it.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Dr. Hines, I have several questions. Well, first question is, Mr. Chairman, do we have a copy of this presentation?
Yes, everybody should have
Okay.
the whole,
Okay.
all the pages. It was sent them, it's in the Google Drive. It was somebody.
Okay.
And there was a public meeting on this too.
And there's also
Okay.
a report. There's a report that that this is based off of, so I can make sure that anyone who doesn't have it has it available to them. It's on our website. Should you want to find it?
Okay. So my first question is, you had mentioned going to the people versus the people coming to us as far as engagement. Give me an example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thank you for that question. So, this was something that came from community concern, in that, so the idea that they voice is that if the police or the government has something that they want to announce or discuss with community, that's typically done on their turf, so to speak, or that, they invite them to a government building or to City Hall, as opposed to coming to their church or coming to their community center or coming to an event that's already taking place to table or to have a conversation. This is not a uniform truth. I believe that is happening on some level, but the residents feel that this is not where the important conversations are happening, and there's not enough of that as a main tool for disseminating information. Am I answering your question?
It does, but I just question how realistic it is, because certainly we as elected officials can't be everywhere. Some of us have a lot of neighborhood associations, some of us have none. I know I personally have community meetings. I send notices out, emails, and I pretty much get the same people over and over again. I probably have about 30 churches in my neighborhood. I would always welcome, to speak at some church, but what you'll find is most of the church members don't live in a neighborhood. You know, in some cases, they don't even live in the city of St. Louis at all. And so I'm just, I don't know how I can manage that. So let me just say that I don't know how I could possibly manage that, you know, going to them. I think because you get such a small group of people that attend meetings anyway, you would be going to 50 different places a month, you know, just trying to educate people. And as we increase technology, you know, that's certainly a good tool to use to try to, you know, have a presentation like we're doing this on Zoom right now, where people don't have transportation to get there, or, you know, whatever issues that may be barriers to them attending public meetings. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because I wasn't sure, you know, where you were coming from with that. It's on one slide, you seem to suggest that we minimize low-level offender traffic stops. So if people had expired tags and different things like that, then, you know, there's no reason to pull them over. Is that what I'm hearing from that?
So the idea for low-level offense is that they're often a proxy for some kind of other effort, right? So people, that's why they're called pretextual stops. That's the pretext, right? We're saying it's about X, but it's really about an effort to identify who's in the vehicle, otherwise monitor the movement of people in the neighborhood, and if possible, get into a search, whether it's in someone's pockets or someone's trunk or backseat. So that is, in order to constrain that behavior, there are other methods that can be utilized to address somebody's low-level offenses. And not all of them require a police officer actually physically engaging with somebody. I recognize that part of our community engagement effort, all right, before anyone else here has a comment, I'm sure you guys have comments, was that folks in the city are concerned about traffic safety. And so this might be something that, if not done thoughtfully and not done on a case-by-case basis, and we don't really think through what the downstream consequences might be, could be not only problematic, but really not respectful of community concern. So you haven't said this yet. If there are concerns of that, I understand them, but the general principle here, the general idea is that limiting or constraining these opportunities for pretextual stops and all the downstream consequences that come from some of these pretextual stops, the use of force, the searches, et cetera, is something that many cities around the country, including the city where I am in Philadelphia, have begun to incorporate.
Well, let me just say this on the benefit of people that I represent. They're sick and tired of people driving around with temp tags 2 years old. You know, they're not paying their property tax, personal property tax. You know, all the good citizens tend to obey and do what we have to do, pay taxes to have services. But then it seems like there's this trend for lawlessness, for the lack of a better word. I know that's a strong word, but it affects people's mental health. It affects neighbors. When you see your neighbor hasn't registered their car for a year and a half and the police, they don't even get a parking ticket for it. You know, it's very frustrating, and it doesn't make you want to, you know, live in that type of environment, because where people just don't have to conform to the law. And I certainly understand, you know, with the pretext stops, they could lead to something major, and probably half the time they do. And because the lawless people are the ones that's, you know, perpetrating a lot of the crimes. And if that's a pretext for catching the bad guys, I wouldn't support that we shouldn't pull people over with expired tags and don't have proper vehicle registration or no license plates at all, because that's not cool. You know, that's not helping the community. They don't do that in the wealthy communities. And we shouldn't accept that and tolerate that in the city of St. Louis. So I totally disagree with your recommendation on that. And I'm not trying to be contentious, but I'm trying to do real talk here. You know, this is real talk. You know, I don't know how many people you talk to. I don't know the percentage of Black people versus white people, neighborhoods that you went to and did all the data collection. But I just know I can speak for people that I represent. So let's talk about ShotSpotter, because my neighborhood, Wells Goodfellow, was one of the first neighborhoods to get ShotSpotter in our community. And we found it to be a useful tool. We are so immune to gunshots that we don't even call 911 anymore. And ShotSpotter have found dead people. Nobody called the police, but the police responded because of ShotSpotter and found somebody shot. And so I find it a very useful tool. And I do find that it's a very good investigative tool as well. But it makes people feel more safe it's almost like a camera, if you will. There are a lot of people, the progressive liberals, that talk about how we don't need cameras because, cameras, don't deter crime. Cameras, Big Brother's always watching. We don't know what the government's doing with the footage. But people in my community want as many cameras as they can get. You know why? Because they are afraid. They are afraid to call on Pookie and Ray Ray because they think there may be some retaliation. So we want cameras. They are a deterrent, and they are also an investigative tool. So I don't want to minimize ShotSpotter at all. Talk to me a little bit more about the St. Louis Public Safety Collaborative. And I think you did say, you might come up with some examples, but I wasn't clear on how that works, that makeup looks like.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so first, let me say on the pretextual stops that the expired registration just one example of that. The baseline for that was, of course, our year-over-year analysis of your police department's data that highlighted significant disparities in car stops for Black people in your city. So I hear what you're saying, and I don't think you're combative at all. I think you're spot on. These are complicated issues and complicated questions, and the solution to them is imperfect. But one of the solutions that we've seen that's been impactful around other cities is the idea that we attempt to constrain. We can, of course, at all times talk about what that constraint looks like. It needs to be tailored to your city. So to your point, maybe in some cities, registration isn't as big of a problem, but in St. Louis, that needs to be something that is more thoughtful. Other activities might be different, and the behavior within that stop is also part of a recommendation. So maybe if you stop me for my registration, you shouldn't be asking me a bunch of other questions, and we should not be escalating to the point that we're searching and otherwise
I agree.
looking through people. I think that ultimately this is why we want these conversations with both folks who really understand the city and represent those who really understand the city, is because these are the issues that really need to be kicked around when we talk about that. So I'm sorry, and you asked about the Public Safety Collaborative, but I really wanted to make sure that we unpack that, because I agree with you. I really do. Public Safety Collaborative, all right? If for those of you who want to Google this, the software is called RTMDX software, RTMX software. The method is called risk terrain modeling. The goal really is to identify opportunities for crime by using existing data and explain why crime might be spiking or existing in a certain area. So, and it uses the actual terrain, not the people, to say the actual built environment, not the people. So specifically what it might do is say that they recognize that a vacant lot adjacent to a school near a bodega creates opportunities for crime en masse by the numbers, right? The program doesn't stop there. It requires inputs from community members, ideally those as close to the problem as possible, to explain why they believe why this particular street corner or this particular area with these characteristics are having a problem. So residents might say, that makes a lot of sense to me. I see people congregating in that lot all the time. It's open, it hasn't been sealed in a long time. Sometimes that people congregating are young people, because when they get out of school, so it's around 3 p.m. And their bodega is another place that they're going to either engage in another activity. Maybe there's narcotics activity, maybe maybe it's retail theft that they're going towards and coming back to the vacant lot. That's the type of narrative that would be created by using the data and utilizing the people from the collaborative or people that the collaborative themselves are seeking input from to say, okay, well, we now understand a more detailed idea of what's happening on this corner. Someone can be tasked with speaking with that school and maybe getting someone whose job it is to move these young people, not just out of the front door, but maybe to a few blocks away to the bus somewhere else, so they're not stopping at that vacant lot.
Why they got this light here? This is shut.
Okay, it's Zoom, right? So someone else.
I'm sorry.
No, it's perfectly right. I thought you had a question. It's all good. I appreciate you listening in. Someone else's job could say, we have to make sure that the government does their response and goes and seals that lot. So someone's going to go put a fence up, and someone can go talk to that bodega owner or otherwise try and figure out how we can work with that bodega owner to limit their portion of this crime spike. All right. Now, the scenarios I offered there did not include the police. There might be some other where someone says, we need the police to do 1/3 of this or 1/4 of this, and the community will do the other parts. So some of them might say, we're going to use the police to solve this particular problem because it might be dangerous, or it might be better, they might be better equipped for it. But what's important to note is that in these scenarios, the police are not the first response, and they're not the only response, and we can lower crime without increasing arrests. So I don't know if that was clear, Mr. Boyd, but if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
I guess I was looking for, the type of stakeholders that made up the collaborative. Are we talking about like this is something like the block unit could take on, and then they have access to this software? I mean, who would be managing the software to come up with the right matrix to solve the problem?
Yeah, it's a great, thank you for your questions. So the software for at least the first year or two, the software will always be out of a group called SIMC, right? It's a group that creates the software. The analysis is something else that can be done in a startup period, also owned by SIMC. There needs to be an independent broker, a credible messenger in the city that has yet to be identified, that would ideally live outside of city government and have that it can be a trusted broker. That's what it's referred to as. And that person should be bringing multiple different stakeholders, some policy folks, but to your point, some individual community members who are operating at a hyper local level. And that should be a continuous feedback loop. And they should be recruiting based on whatever little issues or large issues they're trying to address based on the data. And St. Louis has some infrastructure that could be tapped on this already in terms of community infrastructure. It's a very engaged community, as you already know. And there are some ambassadors or community service officers that exist already. I think there's one per district whose job it is to really try and solve problems. And those people could be brought into this process to really, again, recruit or attempt to address some issues that are spiking in the collaborative.
Okay,
thank you. You want to add?
That's better.
Okay, that makes sense.
I understand.
Okay.
I got 2 more questions left. The public, I forgot the acronym, but the 15 service officers, CSOs. So would they have, you envision that there'll be a marked vehicle where people would know who they are, like they know the police is coming if they make a call to 911? What would that look like?
So yes, they would be in a marked vehicle that would say community service officer, whatever title they have. In the city of Norfolk, where I helped stand up this program, we call them operations officers. And they have small little Ford Ranger pickup trucks in which they drive around. So they would actually respond to the dispatchers. Your radio room dispatchers would be trained on what calls would be diverted to this unit. So they will be in communication with the police department and the dispatchers, the 911 center.
I really like that idea. I think that's pretty creative. Thank you. And the last thing is, first of all, I want to compliment you guys. You guys really did a really good dive into our police department. We reduced our districts from 9 to 6 several years ago, and it's been a disaster. It's just been an absolute disaster. So, and the reason it's a disaster is because of what you guys pointed out. We knew that it made no sense to have 100, I'm just making this an arbitrary number, 100 officers evenly in each district when some district did not have the same level of crime, even that another district, has. Like maybe, in the 3rd district, they deal with a lot of car break-ins and, kind of the low-level stuff, whereas on the north side, we're dealing with gunshots and, personal assaults and all kind of stuff. And we've been fussing, and my colleague, John Muhammad, have been trying to introduce a bill to expand it, more than 6. Have you guys looked at that at all? What were your thoughts about, the size of the districts?
So Rob, feel free to jump in. What we looked at was the workload of the districts, for sure. The size, like the geographic size. Is that what
the amount of districts, do you think expanding the districts outside of 6 would be a better management of the workload as well as an alternative? Or you pretty much think 6 districts is adequate if you balance the workload accordingly?
Yeah, I think that, so I don't have a strong opinion, and Rob, feel free if you have one, about the number of districts. Certainly the staffing within those districts, as you rightly mentioned, should be considered. But no, we didn't think through or analyze what would the impact look like for more districts.
Okay, are you guys done with your research, or is that something you can go back and look at? I'm not sure if you guys are paid to do this, or we just a testing ground or what. So,
Rob, go ahead. I'll answer that second part next.
They are paid, they're paid by the city to do.
okay.
this.
So just to be clear, we're not paid by the city to do anything. We are a nonprofit that's philanthropically funded to do this work around the country, just to be clear.
I appreciate that. That means you can have every right to be non-biased. Thank you.
That's right.
So,
I thought
so
you
that's
were-
why I'm asking the question.
No, it's fine. We're not, Chairman Vaccaro, no problem, but we're not paid, just to be clear. I'm sorry, Chairman Boyd. go
So,
ahead.
that's why I'm asking the question. I would just for the sake of those who think, one or two extra districts may make a difference. I'd be curious as to if you looked at that and, and worked the numbers to see if that's a good option, if you will. Is that possible?
We could, well, we can talk about it, and I can definitely
Okay.
get your information. I don't have a strong answer for you right now, but
Okay.
yeah, certainly the workload issue is top of mind. How workload in more districts could work, I'm not sure about. I will say that there's a secondary conversation that has been surfaced several times about having too many supervisors. So I wonder what the impact of more districts would have on more supervisors. But Rob,
Yeah,
go ahead.
that's always the reason to not do it.
I
Too
think,
many white shirts. But anyway, I'm going to shut up now. I've been talking a long time. Thank you very much. This has really been informative, and I appreciate the majority of your recommendations, 90%.
I'll take 90, no problem.
I think from my standpoint, more important than expanding the actual patrol divisions would be looking at the actual beats of officers that are assigned and expanding or contracting them based on the workload. I think that's a lot easier than actually standing up a whole nother patrol district. But yeah, so let's circle back and talk about that, because yeah, that's an interesting thing, and we can dive a little deeper. I appreciate
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm done.
Yeah, I had thought you were paid by the city. I guess it was that we share our crime information with you. Who are you paid for by? Because I know it was a prior meeting when we talked about sharing information.
Yeah, so you guys do share the information with us for many years now. As part of the National Justice Database, we share a lot of police data on car stops, pedestrian stops, and use of force.
And who funds you?
We have a lot of funding. Some grassroots funding, some larger foundations and organizations. Big tech funds us. But all philanthropically funded. I guess what's important to know about our funding is that they provide the funding, but we provide the direction of how we use those funds.
Okay. Again, I'll let the committee know that next week I have asked and said I would like to see the chief and the public safety director, so that as we start to build on this. So I'm going to go down the list here. Alderwoman Davis, have you joined us? And Alderwoman Howard asked to be excused. Alderwoman Spencer, are you with us, Kara? She's not. Alderwoman Pam Boyd, are you with us? Or I know she may have.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here, Mr. Chair.
Do you have any questions? Or?
I don't have any questions. I just have a comment, because as I was listening, it just seems like the bottom line, and what Alderman Boyd was saying, I think the broken window theory is not working. We're not doing that. And so I think a lot of the crime can be prevented if we did that. So if that meant stopping people for the temp tags or whatever, I just think if we start targeting the smaller things that'll help. And then I think staffing plays a big role. And so I keep telling the police, and we've been talking about this for the longest, that it's been lopsided. And so I'm just curious how that's going to be corrected, because the staffing has been lopsided for years, and North St. Louis has not had the staffing. And I'm glad you all did this, but this is something we've been saying for 20 years, that North St. It has been discriminated north and south in regards to the policing, in regards to the staffing, in regards to everything you were just saying. So what you did was just confirm what we have been saying. So I'm just curious on how we're going to start improving and correcting it.
And so Councilwoman Boyd, Alderperson Boyd, we got a lot of reception from the police department on this. They were eager to hear this, and they said something similar to what you said, that this just solidified what concerns that they already had. They are, as I understand it, actively working to address that. And I'm hopeful that we'll all get an update, and that any support needed from CPE on this that we'll be able to offer. But I believe that they are actively working on addressing some of the issues that were raised in that report.
Thank you very much.
Alderman Boyd, I will say, just like Vice Chairman Boyd had said, almost 2 years ago, myself and John asked for statistics so that we could start to, and they told us a very difficult thing to put together, although the association got it for us in no time. And we're going to have the chief and the public safety director in next week. I asked the clerk to bring them in, because all this needs to come up, whether it's temp tags, we want to go through this, and again, it will take a year or two. It's been that Alderman Muhammad and myself were asking so that we can take a look at, what we were told, part of which is if we can maybe put traffic into the districts, which would allow more police. There was a lot of really good ideas put out there by the association, by the guys on the street. And it seems like we just run into a brick wall. So I just want to say to all the board members, next week, I've already asked a week ago to make sure I want them both in, because this way we can get answers. Alderman Boyd, was there anything else you had of interest or questions?
No, it wasn't anything else. I'm just curious, because like I said, we've been talking about this for years. So now I'm hearing it'll take some more years. And so I just think that we just keep beating a dead horse, and residents have been real clear on what the expectation is. Ironically, in my ward, they did a call to action just for quality of life issues. And so, when is it going, when they going to start seeing a solution to all these studies? Because it seemed like we studying residents to death.
Well, you know what? We're going to do a lot this year in public safety. And if it means creating ordinances, holding people accountable, we're going to move stuff
Sit on
forward.
the porch.
We're going to be, anyway, I'll move on.
And if I can, I want to thank you for that comment, because part of what CPE is working with is the recognition of what you just said, Alderman Boyd, that so many groups go into so many cities, offer so many reports, and they leave town. We, from the beginning of our recommendations, have been committed to seeing through our recommendations through, working on second scopes of work that focus on implementation. And that's something that's different about CPE. We are standing behind our recommendations, and we'll continue to partner with the city for as long as you need us and as long as you'll have us.
I'm just looking at the chat for a second. Okay.
Thank you.
Alderman Brandon Bosley, are you with us?
No, of course, absolutely. I'm here for the discussion on public safety. Million things going on. I do want to kind of add and kind of probe a little bit about the importance of the after school programs. I think that's something we talk about a heck of a lot, but when it comes down to actually funding those things, it's never enough money. After we deal with all the rest of the stuff with public safety, we put all the money into whatever it takes as far as dealing with the after effects. But the preventative measures is never a large amount, or the bulk of our funding being put into ensuring that, these children, the ones who are turning into the people that we're trying to capture, at some point in time, unfortunately, we know that there's a prisoner pipeline, rhetoric that exists here, especially within our neighborhoods. We know where our kids are reading at in certain levels. We know, for sure that our neighborhoods have a lack of access to a lot of different things. No matter what we do out here, if we do not go out here and ensure that these same kids that we're trying to figure out that are 18 and 19 years old how to catch, and after they steal cars, if we don't get them working on cars, if we don't ensure that we put in hundreds of thousands or millions even into making sure that each and every one of our wards, every single one of our neighborhoods have outlets for these youngins, and even for some of these adults, I think we continue to just follow up behind crime. My emphasis would be on ensuring that we can make a more robust after school and summertime program. Even after school, there's a lot that takes place in our communities with idle time. And these children go home every night hungry. A lot of them go home every night to mothers who are working hard, fathers who are working hard, single parent households where people are still out at work when they get there, so they can't fix them a meal. They got to take care of siblings and a gang of other things, other responsibilities at a young age. And they don't have that mental outlet that they need, nor do they have some of the help that they need to be able to take care of some of those responsibilities. So, those things are things that we need to look at, and why individuals feel like a life, not necessarily a crime, that they feel like they have to turn to things that they wouldn't consider a crime. They figure to them sometimes it's survival. I'm gonna break in the grocery store and go steal something to eat. Who breaks in the grocery store to go steal a sandwich? You actually have people in this city shoplifting for cans of food. So when you got situations like that going on, and you have, a lack of empathy towards that on the front end, that's where you get these hardened criminals at, because they feel like, man, I just went in here to get a sandwich. Now I'm in jail. I get out, I get a job. Now I can't get a job because I done got caught stealing. Like, my employer don't want to hear it was just a sandwich. All they care is that you went and took something that wasn't yours. But they don't know about the past and all those different things that took place before I had to get to that point where I thought to myself, crackers ain't enough tonight. Looking in the trash can for something to eat, I don't want to do that no more. Like those, you'd be surprised what these kids are going through. I actually know children have to keep their food cold in the snow, and they hope for snow. Like that's something to think about, when they can't keep the electric on. So it's once again, there's things like that, especially making sure that those after school programs, kids have a safe environment to go through mentally, so they can digress off of their day. They can actually process the day and actually not be processing the day in every moment of the day until the time that they go to sleep. They're looking over their shoulder until they go to sleep and waking up doing the same thing every day. When can they find the peace, to think about all the kid stuff and the fun stuff that comes along with growing up and actually mentally growing from the things that you see in your community that you like to change. Every day they're, once again, in survival mode. So, I'm not going to preach to the choir on that particular piece, but as far as being direct and what it is, I believe that, we could make a really, really big impact on as far as preventative goes. If we get all these youngins that are going to live in the city that we know for sure are ending up in juvenile or starting with younger records, start younger and having records, we start gathering these youngins up and putting them in a place that we all have some control over and have a program that we know for sure works. When it comes down to changing the mentality, and helping people heal, there's a big healing piece, but it's also, we have kids that need somebody to talk to. They don't want to talk to us because they ain't had nobody else to talk to. They are hurting on the inside. There has to be, that social services piece where individuals have access to therapists. They have access to people whom, can help them get to a place where folks like us who have help can, actually help them. Folks will shun some of that help if they don't feel like we even understand them. So there's a lot of dynamics to, especially the preventative piece. But, I think that in itself would change a lot within our city, because people know that there's hope down the street. I got somewhere to go. Right now, you don't have nowhere to go. It's the block or else.
So Alder Member Bosley, I can't say that better than you said it, for sure. You think it's a nail on the head. At the end of the day, in cities around the country, we are criminalizing poverty and we're criminalizing trauma, and we're responding to those issues through our systems of punishment, our police, our prisons, our jails. And at CPE, what we talk about is replacing those systems of punishment with systems of care. Everything you just said would fall into that system of care, and starting to consider that public safety. We're so often failing as a country to consider some of those efforts public safety. I think we should, and I appreciate your words.
So then I appreciate y'all. And just on the car thing, I do agree that there needs to be, we need to look at those things. But there are, once again, I know single mothers out there who, without a car wouldn't have a job, and without that job wouldn't have a car. So on the flip side, if you don't have a job or a car, you don't have a house. If you didn't have a house, you wouldn't be able to take care of your kids. All of those things get down to all of your bills outweigh what it would cost for you to afford to get that car registered correctly. You know, and when it, you know, some folks would say, well, they probably shouldn't have got that expensive of a car. You know, sometimes $500 is a lot. You know, we got elderly people on fixed income. We know our city got people riding around with no insurance. My car's personally been hit by folks with no insurance 2 or 3 times, and I've had to foot that bill myself. So folks who say I should have had full coverage on my car, I had liability just in case I hit somebody else. You know, that I should be covered just in case somebody hits me, but that's not always the case. You know, so with that, you know, people have to go and replace the cars that people that get hit. I think on a case-by-case basis, you know, there needs to be some type of leniency to what it is that folks are going through. We need to have some type of idea of how we can help people who are realistic. If you're going to work every day, you got 2 and 3 jobs. You know, we can realistically look at the amount of income you're making. You're making $10, $12, $13 an hour when it's outweighing, you know, and it's not outweighing your bills. You got, you know, a child or 2 like that. At the end of the day, we didn't come to America. America came to us. And then they took us from Africa and brought us here and said, work for free for 400 years and we're going to beat the hell out of y'all. And then you let us go and then said, go out and get educated. And then for 200 years, you stopped us from being educated. It's covenants on us even learning, man. Like this, you can't put people in psychological situations like that. And then fast forward to 2020 and in 1985, just recently, we had a race riot here over us just being able to come to a park, man. We have historically been left out. So we need access to resources to help right some of those wrongs. And everybody's not responsible for the atrocities that take place, but this city is. And the government is responsible at the same time. So that same government that's imposing and making poverty and impoverished people, you know, once again, poverty.
We lost your, Brandon, we lost your sound. Alderman Bosley, we lost your sound. Can't hear you. Cannot hear you. We still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, it's connected to my Bluetooth. I'm sorry. Probably right after I got a phone call. I'm not sure where I left off at. But
you said the city's responsible.
Yeah. So you know, we are responsible for some of the atrocities that have taken place and some of the issues and problems that exist. I would say a vast majority of them that, you know, everything comes down from generational wealth, and all of our wealth was taken when the land was taken from us. All these people that own stuff around Bevo, not Bevo Mill, but St. Louis Mill Creek Valley, all those old neighborhoods that actually existed where you had hundreds of thousands of Black folks living who actually had the ability to now today generate some type of wealth for their families. All that was taken away. So, you know, the chance that other people have had in this city, everybody has not had that chance. You know, I know for sure, something definitely needs to be done about the individuals driving around with 2 or 3 year temp tags, but some of them are just working hard and trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And they're just as scared riding around with them tags than we are afraid of them riding around with the tags. Hey man, they can't wait to get some money. They hate every time police pull up, you know, people are cringing and like, you know, God, don't pull me over, man. I'm trying, you know, don't tow my car. I'm trying. So it's that flip side to it at the same time, you know. So it is individuals who don't care to. And there's people out here that's still in cars. I think one of the big things we need to do is slow the entire city down also at the same time. People don't feel comfortable. People feel comfortable coming through the city, shooting it up because they can get out of the city super fast. You can run no matter if they pull you over for them tags or not, you know for sure you can run from the police and nobody's going to do nothing about it because they are not supposed to be able to chase you. And as long as you haven't done any violent crime, you can get in and out the city if they didn't witness it. So that's an issue in itself. And I think even given the right tools and giving everybody new temp tags, we still are going to have that problem of individuals treating the police officers in the city like they have no jurisdiction over them. So, you know, those are my 10 seconds. I really appreciate, you know, you all taking the time to bring the information forth. I can't wait to really read every bit of it. I appreciate the presentation also. I think it was 97 pages. I was reading through some of it the other day. It's like, man, it's long. You know,
yeah,
but I appreciate it.
It seems long. It's about 24 pages plus an addendum, which is a longer addendum. So the report, you can probably get through it over breakfast. It's around 24 pages.
Understood. But I mean, I don't care about the long day. I read it all. I appreciate it, folks.
Thank you for your comments. Very inspiring. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Alderman John Muhammad. Alderman Muhammad, are you with? Yes, there's.
I am. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both participants. I just have a couple of quick questions. Just doing some quick research and studying on CPE. and I seen that you guys were instrumental in similar work in New York. Where are we at today with that? What was the progress made? What are the changes that was made from a report that you released in New York? I believe that was.
You're on mute. So we missed the end of that question.
Gotcha. Can you share a little bit of the work that was done in New York with me?
Sure, I'll start. Rob, feel free to jump in. As a result of Executive Order 203, then Governor Cuomo asked for all public safety, all police departments, all law enforcement, I should say, in the state to offer a plan about how they were going to center and address the inequities that Black and Brown people in the state were feeling as a result of or receiving as a result of policing. Our partners in Ithaca decided that they wanted to take a step beyond that and really address the structural issues within their police department, the public safety system. We worked with them over the course of more than a year, almost a year and a half, to come up with around 18 recommendations. Those were put in front of their city council. Their city council asked for a plan on recommendation 1. Recommendation 1 was focused on recreating or reorganizing their public safety system to include a team of unarmed responders and a team of armed responders. The armed responders would be their existing police department. Both of those units would have a director. The police chief would be the director of the armed unit, and then there'll be a director of an unarmed unit. Both of those directors would report to a commissioner of public safety. The working group of all community members, including some police officers and some council people, worked through some really complicated issues, including the call delineation, or specifically which calls will be handled by which responders. Worked through a lot of other questions around technology, around beat design, and really came away with some really clear plans around recommendation 1. That work wrapped up in early March. That was sent to their common council. Their common council is currently debating that and discussing that. They've had 2 meetings around that already. Should say 3 meetings. They had 1 council meeting and then another close, or what they call committee of the whole. They're probably going to do another one, and we're waiting for that debate, that active debate around the plan to be voted on. That should be or may be voted on this spring and implemented whenever they are ready, ideally sometime this summer or fall. But all of that is kind of held up at this point, waiting for their city council to determine when there's going to be a vote, and then of course passing this via a vote. So it's more complicated. There's a lot of different moving parts there, but that's the summary there. Rob, is there anything I missed that you feel like we need to make sure we highlight?
No, one of the biggest issues is they have a strong mayor, and it's changing the power of the mayor by putting a layer of government between the police chief and the mayor. So that is one of the items they're debating. And since they're actually changing the city charter by doing that, it'll probably have to go for a referendum to voters in November. However, they're still waiting for a legal review of that to determine whether or not it's a referendum or not.
Does that answer your question, Alderman?
Sure, thank you. So one more question, well, 2 more questions here. I'm looking at different case studies that you guys have done, over the last several years. And in each case study, I'm able to read in depth about defunding the police and how it directly correlates with whatever city or territory you guys are focusing in on at that time. And that's not really outlined or detailed in this case study, congruent with St. Louis. So I guess my question is, was there any, out of all of the surveys and the virtual town hall meetings, out of the feedback and the community input, was there any cause for defund the police at all? just doing a quick search here, I found defund the police once in this report. So I'm just interested in knowing, was there any cause for that? Because I think addressing that and actually defining what that means and the impact it could have on our city, especially our communities that are already marginalized and under police and over police at the same time. Just want to know if there's anything a little bit more substantial that we could look at in regards to that term.
Yeah,
as it relates to St. Louis.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. The general idea of defunding the police is not, or you mentioned the definition, isn't really accepted around the country or really in St. Louis based on our experience. So just to be clear, some folks might say defund and they mean abolish. They mean they do not want a police department. They want something else. They want some other response to crime that is more community centered. Other folks are talking about defunding. What they mean is really a right sizing of policing. Similar to what the mayor might say, sending the right responder to the right problem, shrinking the police department's budget to a point where it's appropriate, and focusing on how we still have a police department, but they're constrained and have limited tasks. That actually tracks quite well with the rest of the country, where there are people, and you know this probably better than I do, in St. Louis who might have taken option one there, the abolish. Other folks who are talking about it in a really more targeted way, and including that refund period, right, where you defund so you can fund something else, and not you defund to be punitive, right? And so those folks are all part of your community. Our efforts uncovered that there are a lot of people who are aligned with the mayor's current vision of sending the right responder to the right problem, and that their defund conversations were about the idea that those budget items can or should come from the police department. At CPE, we agree with the idea of right sizing policing. As I mentioned, we also recognize that we have to improve the systems we have while we build the systems that we need. And so we're not necessarily having a conversation nationally around the idea that we just defund. I support the idea that community members feel like police have not been good for them, have not been a supportive entity in their lives, have been harmful in their lives, which is why they might be saying abolish. But our work is really focused on how we can improve the current public safety system, recognizing those community concerns, trying to unpack it with them, trying to bring that into a process that is more deliberate in terms of how we actually operationalize, how to make policing the right size, and how to limit the harm that they feel they're receiving from police. And it's complicated, like all of these conversations are complicated. And that general idea, that tension is a super complicated issue that we experience around the country. And I hope I'm answering your question, that we, yes, experience in St. Louis. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. And let me say, if you caught me smiling when I was talking, it's because I noticed that beautiful painting behind you. One of my favorites right there.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. He's misunderstood, but we love him. We love him. One more question, if I can, Mr. Chairman. You guys started this, I guess, this public process right around September of last year.
So when you said this process, do you mean the overall partnership or the effort to draft this current report?
I guess the overall process.
We've partnered with the city of St. Louis in our National Justice Database. That's the report that we launched in September. So that was actually the end of that review period. But yes, the reimagining work, the report that you have in front of you, was something that we started to discuss around the spring of last year and began in earnest around the end of the summer, early fall of 2021.
Right. And what did that public participation aspect look like in regards to it? And I'm asking because one of the things that I know is when I host community meetings or community events now, that there was a big decline in attendance because of the COVID pandemic, right? So just want to know, do you think that it could have been better community input or more community input had it not been in these COVID times, or now even in this post-COVID area that we're in? Was there any thought about that?
Yeah, so I would, if I can change your question a little bit, there
Sure.
is thinking about that. We are actively continuing to engage our community. We have two people who live in St. Louis who are working for CPE, whose sole goal or sole role is community engagement, in both disseminating the report and getting feedback about the report. A lot of the stuff that you guys are telling us here. So those folks are on the ground. We can put you in touch with them if that's helpful. But to answer your question, the effort that led to the report, which again, I want to stress is an ongoing community engagement effort, but we did at a certain point cut it off for the report in terms of what we're reporting on. That could always have gotten better. To your point, it was virtual. We had to engage with people. I'll talk a little bit more about that process. Not only was it virtual, but one of the older women that was on the call today mentioned that the community has just been studied and studied and studied. All right. I mentioned earlier that the St. Louis has a really active community, and especially in this criminal justice space, people who are really interested in doing this and have a lot of knowledge. So our goal was really to digest that work, make sure we weren't coming in without having read and really absorbed as much literature as possible that was drafted by or supported by people in the city. So we did something of a literature review, but really a deeper, more community engagement literature review, trying to see what advocates are saying and what they've been asking for. Then we kind of snowballed. And when I say snowballed, I mean, we asked one person for an interview. And then before we end that interview, we say, can you please introduce us to as many people as you can, and give them the pitch about why that would be helpful. And as you know about your city, people were very gracious about that. A lot of people did introduce us to whether it was another community group or community stakeholders in the community. It was a short period of time, as you referenced. It was only 4 or 5 months that we were able to do that. So of course we could have done more. We really wanted to take, we felt like we reached this point of saturation, which is really a conversation about and qualitative research. When you feel like you've gotten enough of the same answers, you feel confident that you're onto something. All right, confident, not definitive. All right. So what we represented is what we think is a confident representation of the community sentiment. And to your point, we also recognize that there's a whole lot more. There's corners of the city that we need to get to. And we want to take our own advice. We're telling you all to go to places, to go to the people directly. The reason we had these contractors on the ground is because we want to go directly to people. So our folks are trying to build relationships with churches and other community groups to ensure that we are still pushing our findings into those spaces and still asking the right questions about people to understand their sentiment about how they're experiencing community engagement, public safety in the city. And that's an ongoing effort and will be for as long as we're present.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. So you mentioned 2 people on the ground here in St. Louis. Just for transparency, can we get the names of those 2 individuals?
Sure. Rhonda Smith Branch is one of our folks, and I want to say it's Tashara. No, sorry, Tashara's the mayor. No, it is Rob. It's Tashara, not Jones, right? I have her name here. I'm almost confusing her with the mayor, but I have it here, and I will pull it up very quickly to make sure I don't give you guys the wrong name.
Sure. And while you're looking for that, Dr.
Tashara Earl.
What is it?
Tashara Earl.
Tashara Earl.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. So and we can put you in touch with them. And to your point about transparency, that's not a secret. So you guys can definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So another question for transparency: the raw data that was used to compile this report, will that be shared with this committee and the members of the Board of Aldermen?
So yeah, the raw data is not ours. It's yours. It's the city's. So the data that came to us from the police department. So I understand the police chief and the director of public safety are coming to this committee next month or next week. I'm not sure when you guys meet. I'll note that the raw data next week. All right. Okay. So that data was simultaneously shared with us and with Forward Through Ferguson, which you probably know of. So they could receive the analysis or do their analysis. So I do think that there is an opportunity to get that from them. I can't speak for them, but I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to receive it.
Absolutely. We should have that data and that information. It has not been the easiest getting information from our police department. Going on about 4 years now, asking for raw data like this to figure out how to reimagine, as you say, our public safety or our police department. I have no further questions, Mr. Chair, but I would like to say thank you for coming. And I love when you spoke about the insufficiencies in district staffing. We know that quality is not equity. And in the neighborhood that I represent here in the 21st Ward, we need more police officers. We need more police resources than some of our counterparts in South City. So I want to thank you for that. And that was my favorite section reading. So thank you for that. And again, I love that painting. W.E. Du Bois, you gotta love him. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming. Both doctors, thank you for coming. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
And so, and I mentioned we'll have, I also, as I'm thinking about this, we will ask a representative from both police associations to come in after the chief and the director of public safety as we work our way through this. Alderman Oldenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rob, Hans, good to see you guys again. Thanks again for being present and allowing the presentation to take place here in this space. Appreciate you guys. I just have a couple of questions, and some of these might be I'm going to hold some back because I think it's probably better to talk to the chief and the public safety director about some of the resource shifting. But can you guys talk to me a little bit about the workload hours versus the percentage of proactivity that was discussed in the report? I think it's something about proactivity, which I believe means proactive policing, building checks, other standard checks that an officer would do in a given shift, and what the sort of best practices percentage of that is versus radio calls, and where those largest disparities exist might be helpful.
Sure, I'll take first swing at that. So the accepted ratio is 60% of an officer's time should be answering calls for service and following up on calls for service, report writing, or whatever that follow-up looks like. And 40% of that time should be unencumbered. That would allow meaningful community engagement, proactive policing in what they know is hotspots, and really showing up in spaces where they need to be, and where they know that there's community violence. And so oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, the science is pretty clear. Just the presence of a police officer walking through a neighborhood or walking on a corner can reduce community violence just by mere presence without making any engagement at all. The science is real clear there.
Agreed.
So that's the ratio we're looking for. It's 60% and 40% unencumbered time to do proactive things.
Okay. And I think the report sort of saw, right, and I don't think to Alderwoman Boyd's point, I don't think to anyone's surprise that the radio call stacking was disproportionate in North Patrol districts, meaning that there were way more calls of service and radio stacks that did not allow for that 40% of proactivity. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Again, so I mean, that's great that the data has finally caught up with, I think, what most reasonable people in the city would agree with, and know that, hey, let's put resources, the right resources, in the right spots, and particularly where there's violent crime. I don't think there's any disagreement on that, and that's good that the data is sort of proving that out in this report. I did have a couple of questions, and this might be either a sidebar conversation with you all, but I do want to say it for the record in front of the committee, which is it looked like the report called for in the 2nd district that a lot of us on this committee represent, which is also one of the city's largest districts, and also it leads the city in property crime, called for a reduction of 2 officers, it looked like, from 57 to 55. And I don't have the Manning tables in front of me, but I'm a little confused with that because I think there's 82 or 83 officers patrol officers that are charged in the 2nd district. So I don't know where sort of, call it 27 or 28 officers went in that, and that may be a question for the chief, but I don't know if you have an ability to maybe respond to that or not.
No, other than what's outlined in that report, which is an appendix to the overall report, how the police department actually operationalizes that strategy is up to Chief Hayden and Lieutenant Colonel Sack. I think Lieutenant Colonel Sack's the guy you want to talk to, because he really
you're
knows
right.
these numbers.
That's what I figured, but I did want to ask that question and let the committee members and my colleagues know I plan to ask that again as I sift through the data to the folks that are the day-to-day with the police department. So I think we established it's a bit of a nuanced conversation when it comes to pretextual stops, and I think it would behoove this committee to work with the police department to figure out how we find a balance there. And I'm glad that that there was a conversation holistically around that, because I do, and Rob, maybe you can speak to this as being a beat cop for 2.5 decades plus. I do think there is some merit in not ticky-tacky, stops, but stops that can be constrained around, temp tags, or again, the broken windows theory. And I think sometimes we conflate the broken windows theory with stop and frisk. I do think those can be compartmentalized, and I would enjoy kind of working with this committee and others on, well, okay, if it's just constrained to the actual temp tag stop or the license plate registration stop, I think there's merit in feeling that conversation out a little bit. So I do appreciate you guys speaking to that. But I do think there's merit, Rob, right, and when you speak to a lot of officers, merit in making sure that the little things also, there's a statement around those aren't going to stand either. With some respect to then the notion that larger concerns then can also go unaddressed. Real quick, moving to the community service officers, I think you all said it was 18% of the calls could be handled by what we're calling either community service officers or unarmed employees to handle a given task. So this could be things like, one issue in the 2nd district, but I think in a lot of districts, police districts, are derelict vehicles, right? And let's tow those vehicles that have been sitting around for a month. And quite honestly, the police, again, we thought they got radio calls stacked up. It may be honestly a week or two before they can visit a car that we know has been sitting there maybe a month. And maybe it just got called in a couple of weeks ago, but that would be one example, right? That we think in unarmed, or just to put it on a tangible, real life level that a taxpayer can respond to. That would be one example you think that an unarmed community service officer could address.
Oh yeah, that's correct. And that their responsibilities would reflect St. Louis and the needs of St. Louis. Those are just ideas. For instance, taking cars back and forth to the city garage or for an oil change doesn't have to be a cop. Right. A community service officer can do that and free up the time of a police officer, as well as taking evidence to the evidence lab or taking paperwork between precincts. It can go as low as that. That's what we did here in Norfolk, and it really freed up a lot of time.
That's great. I think that does again, and this is a recommendation is a recommendation, but I think that does I will bring it up to the members of our committee. I think that will probably facilitate a labor conversation with the police unions as well, as to is that responsibility that potentially is being taken from an officer, whether it would be perceived that way or not. I think it's worth a healthy conversation with the police union, before we give any sort of full-throated endorsement of that recommendation, at least speaking for myself. I think it's important to just note that. Additionally, I had a question around, do you guys have any data keeping in the same topic of community service officers, cops and clinicians, et cetera? And Rob, maybe drawing from your experience as a police officer, I mean, clearly there's a situation where what could be viewed as a very routine, no need for armed officer could turn into a conflict very quickly, right? And I wonder if there's any data around that. So sticking with the example of a derelict vehicle, and an unarmed citizen or community service officer begins to engage, called the tow truck, is on the scene. By coincidence or happenstance, the owner of said vehicle shows up. It's a stolen vehicle. Let's just stick with that example for now. And it's a criminal or somebody who's got warrants or priors out, and get away from my car. And that's an escalated situation where we don't now have an armed officer who's trained to de-escalate and or neutralize that situation. Another example might be in a domestic situation. Now, maybe armed officers are still, attaining to those with a trained social worker. But I wonder if there's any data, as well as, would welcome real-time anecdotal research through your experience, that says a certain percentage of those responses by a community service officer can turn violent or maybe even deadly.
Well,
that was a big windup, I understand, and I hope the upshot is there any data that suggests a certain percentage of those unarmed officers ended up in an area where we wish we would have had an armed officer?
No, I don't know of any evaluation of programs. However, I keep coming back to Norfolk because I had a great deal of input in a lot of the systems here. But since the beginning of the pandemic, they really, with my encouragement, started tracking alternative reporting and things like that these unarmed responders are handling. But anecdotally, I would say the people who have the greatest de-escalation skills I've ever seen are parking enforcement people. And I'm sure St. Louis has parking enforcement.
I think I would agree with that statement.
Those women and men they have the greatest de-escalation skills because that's all they have, right? They have to be able to de-escalate because they don't have a badge and a gun and handcuffs, and they can't punch somebody in the nose after about 30 seconds because they get tired of it. So that's been my experience, and I don't see. I've seen places where I would have lost my patience with people, and these women and men who were parking enforcement were able to just smooth it out without a drop of blood. And I'm always amazed by them, but they learned that somehow, and I think they learned because they have to learn that de-escalation. But they always have communications with the police department. So if something like you described goes badly, I've more than once have backed up a parking enforcement person. I think that's a great example. And just the presence of a police officer stopped that really bad confrontation. But that was a rarity in my experience.
Okay. And maybe the response is those are outliers. I'm sorry, Hans, but maybe those are outliers. But just to make sure there was no collection of data that exists now that kind of says a certain percentage of those community service officer responses turned in another direction.
So
right?
I think there might be, right? So
okay,
we're talking about higher level responders now, right? So in Denver they have the STAR program, which is a mental health response. They have Cahoots, which is in Oregon, and in Chicago recently started a mental health response. So these are responses to more acute situations than we're describing in these CSOs. But but they're not with the police. So I think it's kind of in the middle of these examples. But places where police were the sole responder, and what we're seeing in those three examples and beyond are less use of force, resolving issues without arrests, and to Rob's point, while they have access to backup from police, they are very rarely utilizing that backup. So, it could come down to options. It could come down to power. People recognize that, a mental health responder or an unarmed responder doesn't have the power to take away their life or their liberty. So they're less triggered for a variety of reasons. I don't want to diagnose why here. It could be de-escalation skills, but by the numbers, those programs that are different, again, than the CSO program, but if they're different because they're handling higher level calls, not lower level calls, are not seeing the problems I think that you may be looking for or wondering if they exist. They're seeing these issues resolved without any further force, any further incident.
That's a good point. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, that's all I got. Gentlemen, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Okay, so we're gonna go to Alderman Brett and Ryan, but I do want to throw in all your studies, something that Alderman Muhammad and myself went and looked at. It's only 42% of the force that actually answers radio calls. And is that, so you came up with the same, and the amount of white shirts that have staff that go get their, whatever done for them. To me, it looks like we could do better than that. And we will have the associations come in after. So anyway, Alderman Brett and Ryan, you're up.
Thank you. Just to tack on to my colleague from the 16th question, I was going to ask a similar question regarding incidents with the unarmed officers finding themselves in difficult situations. And then I was just kind of curious, and I know that this would be something that if we were to pursue this, that we could make the rules and regulations, but I'm curious in Norfolk or in other jurisdictions, these unarmed officers, are they truly unarmed, or do they just not have a gun? Do they have a mace? Do they have a baton? Do they have anything that if they do find themselves in a untenable situation, are they truly defenseless, or do they have something? Do they have some means of protecting themselves?
So in Norfolk, we call them operations officers. Well, not we anymore, they. After so long, it's that royal we. They have pepper spray. But I will say, I'm not sure if they've ever used it on anything other than a dog. But I will preface that with, for those who don't know Norfolk, it's a military town, and probably 90% of the operations, unarmed responders, are retired military folks who still have that public service motivation, who want to be out in the community. So they wear a different uniform, and they just approach things as that really wise, salty old sea dog, and I think it's their approach that their demeanor is different, the way they approach people. And we don't have young people who want to be cops taking this job. Like I said, 90% are retired military people who just want to keep serving their community. So I think it'd be important who fills those roles as well.
Sure. And then to tack on to that, and I'm not sure about Virginia's laws surrounding firearms in general, but are there rules specifically prohibiting these officers from carrying a firearm while they're on duty?
Yeah, the city rules, there's a policy against that. However, Virginia is like Missouri, kind of anything goes, open carry. We do have concealed carry licenses, but they're easy to come by. But Virginia is an open carry state. There's guns everywhere.
Okay. I have nothing further. Thank you so much for your time and for the presentation.
Thank you. And Alderwoman Rice and Alderman Stevens, I'm just going to go down, but I won't forget you're there, and we'll get through everybody here shortly. We only got, on the committee, I still have Alderwoman Clark Hubbard and Alderman Page, and then I'll go to Stevens and then Rice. Okay. Just so I don't want anybody to think I'm leaving anybody out, because I think this is important for everyone. So Alderwoman Shameen Clark Hubbard.
Yes, I don't have any questions as usual. By the time you get to me, all the questions that I had thought of have been answered. But thank you so much for the presentation.
Where are you at? You got a big badge on.
You know my name.
I was trying to think of it. I mean, I thought maybe I saw. Anyway, thank you. Alderman Page, you're up.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I am happy to report that some of the burning questions that I had earlier have been addressed, some more satisfactorily than others, but in the interest of time, I will yield back. I'd like to offer sincere thanks to Drs. Kenter and Minos for an outstanding presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're very welcome. Then we'll go to Alderman Stevens. I noticed you've been with us for a while.
Yes, thank you, Chairman and members of the Public Safety Committee, as well as our guests from the CPE today. Now I'm on my Chromebook, so am I breaking up at all, or it can be a bit spotty? I'm coming through okay? Okay.
Your answer's very good. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. So thank you again for the presentation. I'm eager to read through the 110-page report. I'm one who likes graphs and charts and all that, so I appreciate not only having the data, but then having not one, but two graphs for each. I was wondering, one, the 2019 data, I mean, you know, being in 2022, is that because it is our last full year of data before the city of St. Louis had to switch to NIBRS, the federal reporting system, or?
So they use that data because the 2020 data with the beginning of the pandemic was really wonky to use really specific data terms. It's wonky data, and we didn't have the full 2021 data yet. So they did have 5 years of data, 2014 through 2019, but they used the 2019 data to make most of those recommendations because it was the last full year before the pandemic.
Yeah, and you know, that's not uncommon at the moment, I think, for any major organization or industry to use 2019. We've just run up in the past where present data is hard to get, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the switch to a new system, the NIBRS system. So I wanted to clarify. With regards to the 2 peaks, so you gave us a weekly or a sort of 7-day look for peak for calls for service, which seems to indicate that the highest peaks are Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. And then also an annual look, which I appreciate, where it seems that it's really the summer months, specifically July through September, that really peak. I think it was what, plus 11% in calls for service. Has there been any comparative analysis based on other criteria? You know, why are we seeing a peak in between 4 to 5 on weekdays or work days versus, you know, or why are we seeing peaks in the summer versus the winter? I mean, I think it's easy to assume like, well, summer months, you know, there's not as many emergency resources for overnight shelter necessarily, or so on and so forth. But has there been any, in the scope of this current study in front of us that you've presented on today, was there any comparative analysis to other factors that might be at play, or is this just hard data from SLMPD?
Right, that's just their hard CAD data. And,
okay.
You know, a baseball stadium, I think downtown Live is up in the summer. So the more people that come and stream into the city, I think it's only natural that the workload goes up a little bit. But yeah, that's just anecdotal. That was just hard data from the dispatch system. Okay.
Oh, but see, that's why I'm so grateful to pose this question directly to you two, because that's an excellent point, anecdotal or otherwise. In the summer months, we get the sports teams, right? So I was thinking weather, but I bet that is an excellent point. Oh, the CSO, if we can come back to the CSO, it would serve as a complement to, or sort of separate from, the Cops with Clinicians, correct? It doesn't seek to replace it, but rather it seeks to shift some of the non-policing or non-public safety duties onto the community service officer. Is that correct? So it doesn't seek to replace the Cops with Clinicians, but to rather sort of complement or work side by side it?
I think it would be a different workload than the Cops and Clinicians. The Cops and Clinicians, I've been led to believe, we've been working very closely with Wilfred Pickney at the mayor's office, who's involved in that program, and they handle more of that, the mental health and those mental health adjacent calls. This community service officer, in our opinion, would handle some of those low risk calls of service that are currently being handled by the police department. Okay, perfect. And then I had another one written down, but I didn't write down enough information to remember what the question was. Again, it was with specific regards to the shots fired
calls for service, specifically for shots fired, peaks from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. And just sort of piggybacking off of that comparative, what other factors are at play? Why is it 9 to 11 p.m.? But that one's on me because I did not leave myself enough detail. So I think that would be interesting to, and I do believe it's incumbent upon us as the legislative branch of government to try and draw those comparisons or gather the sufficient data for the sort of auxiliary factors. But otherwise, that's all I've got. I do appreciate this presentation and this report. I think it's an excellent report from what I have read so far. And I just thank you for your work in helping to make St. Louis and our public safety system a little bit better. So thank you, gentlemen. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Alderwoman Rice, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the Public Safety Committee. And thank you, gentlemen, for coming and explaining some of the report to us. I, frankly, when you said, that we're working to replace systems of punishment with systems of care, that resonates so deeply with me and with the work that I'm interested in doing, here in our community as well. I think that's a really great frame and a really great grounding for this work. And I would love, Mr. Chairman, I know that you said that there are going to be continuing meetings with the chief and with Director Isom, and then with potentially the members of, or representatives from our police unions. And I'm wondering, and maybe this is too big of an ask, but for either of the doctors here from CPE to be able to be on those calls as a resource to sort of explain, alongside, so that the chief and the director can say, hey, here's what we're working on from this. And if there are questions, because I feel like we get these reports and then we disconnect from the implementation. And I love that you all are planning on staying here and helping us through that. But to be a part of that continuing conversation, I think could be really valuable. So Mr. Chairman, if that's something you're open to.
No, that would be nice. Can you guys make some of our continuing meetings?
Sure. I mean, I don't know when they are, but yeah, we will make every.
Well, next week, hopefully, and the week after, and then probably shortly after we start getting all the input and we start thinking about what we're going to do, then I hope to start maybe having community meetings or community Zoom meetings. And what my hopes is that we actually put some real legislation together that puts some of this in play. So yes, Alderwoman Rice, I agree with you 100%. It would be nice if they could join us.
Sure. Well, and of course, pending your availability, gentlemen, I understand.
Yeah. I'll note that we're actively meeting with the city. So we meet with them about once a week on these issues. It's a standing meeting. But that doesn't mean that we're not happy to come and meet with you all as well as much as possible. So yeah, so we're based on our schedules, we're happy to support.
Sure, that's wonderful. And I, thinking about, there were a couple of key points that you raised in the presentation that I wanted to ask about if I could quickly here. So overall, the community engagement piece, I think that is something that, from all levels of our government, it's been clear to me since getting elected that the more we do community engagement, the better we serve. And that's from everything from our Citizen Service Bureau to our development deals to, policing and public safety. And one of your recommendation in here for community engagement, you're envisioning that as a community engagement from either the police department or sort of the Department of Public Safety, empowering that community engagement. So it wouldn't be us as alder people going out and drumming up those meetings and making sure folks are coming, because a lot of that responsibility gets shifted to us sometimes, and we don't always have the best reach. Or like Alderman Boyd said, we get the same 5 people that show up every time. But so building that capacity in as a city department with us as partners, of course. But is that kind of what you're imagining?
Yeah, so I think it's all of it, right? So certainly the feedback we got was broken down by the police department's efforts, as well as so to speak, City Hall's efforts, above the police department's efforts, and that the general idea was that information was not disseminated in a way that people felt was really reaching them, or that they had opportunities to provide feedback. Sure. And so, yeah, I think honestly, that didn't include some folks in the other areas of government, including the older people, but was not limited to that.
Sure.
Our recommendation certainly was focused on utilizing resources, creating a plan. And so the plan itself might include understanding what your priorities were and how those are aligned with priorities of the administration or of the police department and a shared output or shared strategy. So it doesn't necessarily put the onus on you all, but really seeks to answer those questions through an organized plan that says, here's how we're going to do this, and here are the people that are going to be involved in that plan. So
Sure.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I guess one of the problems that we run into as elected folks is, the mayor's administration, frankly, too, is that we're all up for election every couple of years. And so when those things change, building an office of community engagement or building that muscle for the city that will continue past any of us, I think creates that reliability and that trust from the citizenry into the government, let alone into public safety. And so that's sort of my 2 cents is, how do we build that office to continue to function long after we're gone, so that relationship continues to function.
That sounds great.
Okay, so then the question specifically about the shot spotter. So this is one that has come up a number of times, and we've heard other cities. There have been, and I was actually kind of surprised to hear you say that we would potentially be holding on to it for evidentiary value, because that's one of the main questions that has been raised in some other cities, is tampering with the shot spotter record then being used in prosecution. And so I'm curious, did that come into play in the conversation at all?
So I think I failed to be clear about when I said evidentiary value, what I meant, specifically the ballistics, specifically the science that identifies which bullets left which firearms, and when they are left at scenes, when the casings of those bullets are left at scenes, how they can be traced using Robertson Nibin's machine. Is that right? Okay. Using what's called a Nibin machine that can help in investigations, and specifically help those investigations by saying, we found this firearm, and now because of the science, we know all of the areas where ShotSpotter or other leads tell us that weapon was used.
Okay.
And that's the investigative utility of ShotSpotter that was described to us by the police department. Does that make sense?
That it does. I guess I still have some question, and I can't remember. I'm blanking now on this city.
You're correct. There are uses of ShotSpotter in terms of general technology that have been really called into question. So what you're referencing is not incorrect.
Okay.
So people have used, and there's a couple of examples that are escaping me now, but where they're from, where ShotSpotter technology, when paired with a camera, was used to suggest that a person that was driving a vehicle, I think it was a red light camera, was responsible for discharging a firearm. That's an example that actually happened, and it was used as evidence against them.
Right.
Even though it was not actually accurate, and it was not really a fair leap to make from that based on those two uses of technology.
Right.
So surveillance in general, that's a hot button issue around the country. St. Louis is no different. And so there should be guardrails on that surveillance. We didn't necessarily get into that in our report because it wasn't something that came up as more than like a general recommendation. But to your point, there are many groups and many people, ACLU included, that have questioned how any of these surveillance technologies impact people, and particularly impact Black and brown people in our cities around the country. So
Sure.
I appreciate you raising it.
Yeah, and I kind of on that note, I'm curious. So to me, the technology paired with the human element is where that is where we find our key connection. Is what is our trust in the technology? Where can we best partner in a way that benefits both safety, community trust, that type of thing. And this is where I think that transparency piece, that community engagement piece, is so vital. Because some of what we have in the city is some of the cameras we utilize have flashing lights, particularly to warn, to tell people, hey, we have a camera here, right? And that has a particular value. Or when residents have their own cameras, that has a particular value. And I'm wondering, with ShotSpotter, there were some questions that I've heard as well, particularly there that, and I'm curious because you said disclosing sort of where they are, is that sort of an unhelpful reliance on technology to where folks are not calling the police when shots are fired. And this also could be connected to the fact that in some of these areas where ShotSpotter is deployed, there are so many gunshots that like a citizen can't just call them all in. But the evidentiary value of a human making that phone call and trying to pinpoint, hey, here's what I heard, here's what I saw, or, you know, I heard a car speeding away, has a different evidentiary value or a different police deployment value than just a shot spotter going off. And so I'm curious though, have you heard anything in the work that you've done about sort of an unhelpful reliance on that technology? That question makes sense. Okay.
It does. And so first I want to say that when it comes to ShotSpotter notifications in St. Louis and beyond, there's really, in St. Louis in particular, there's really no data that clarifies when the ShotSpotter was the only notification of a gun being discharged.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's not true, and I believe in the folks who have more information than I do. But when we try to understand, is there a differentiation? In other words, do we know when there was just a ShotSpotter call, just a 911 call, and more importantly, do we know when both came in? That data isn't kept and categorized in that way. So we actually don't know en masse how many of the discharges or the shots fired were solely notified by ShotSpotter and no other call came in. But to your point, the reason we recommended the idea of notification of the community is because community, to your point about the flashing lights, has a right to know when they're being surveilled on any level. And to your point also about why it's there. If it is because the police department or the city says, you know, there's a lot more gunfire here than there is somewhere else, then they need to understand that rationale, and that needs to be explained to them. If there's some other rationale, they need to be explained that as well. But where they are and why it's there is important for community to understand as it relates to overall surveillance tech, including ShotSpotter. And so the over-reliance question is, I think, an important one. And one of those is really, you know, the over-reliance in terms of as an investigative tool. Are we still doing the level of investigations, level of police work that was once being done before we had this kind of access to video footage and other surveillance tech? And that's certainly a question. I'm happy to hear from Rob, but I'm not aware of any literature that suggests that these technologies are causing people to pull back. I mean, it's a reasonable hypothesis. I'm just not aware of anything that says that.
Sure. Sorry, was that a window for sorry, Dr. Kenter? Do you have any,
sorry.
Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that?
There's nothing I can add to that.
Okay. I really appreciate it. You know, surveillance, my colleagues know that surveillance technology has been one of the areas that I have been working on. And I really appreciate the honest conversation about it. So that, and, you know, building trust in who is responding to your call, I think is the ultimate goal here, right? Whoever it is that is responding to the call, whether it's, you know, an unarmed responder, these community service officers, and that actually, so you're probably then familiar with the public safety work, that evaluation that you've done. You're familiar with our Citizen Service Bureau, as that is under the Department of Public Safety. Was there any conversation? So Citizen Service Bureau is, you know, who our citizens call when there's, you know, lights out or trees that need trimmed or sidewalks, all of our city services, dumpsters getting overflowed. And we have individual, each ward is supposed to have one person per ward that is responding to this. And I'm wondering sort of what the integration is for the calls that we could be deferring away from an armed police officer. So in your list of calls for service, so things from, you know, even investigating cars that have been abandoned, or there were a whole list of them here, where that integration could potentially happen. Was that something that you all looked at?
So yeah, it was part of our active conversation in probably those two buckets, so the CSOs, right? But also, as I mentioned earlier, in the risk terrain modeling, the folks that could be utilized or dispatched to address issues that are coming up in these conversations. As I understand it, these groups, these personnel right now are responsive to issues that might come in through 311 or, you know, through a council person's office, or sorry, an older person's office. And that's how they're dispatched. So what we would say, and this is all really being loosely sketched out at this point, but is part of the active conversation, we would say that those people should also be dispatched or utilized or tapped into by some of the risk terrain modeling, the risk narratives, and the public safety collaborative that would say, here's another thing that we need our ambassadors, or I'm not sure what the title of the person is, to be addressing. So yes, I think there's multiple opportunities for them to plug in, both in the risk terrain, both in the idea of another responder, and just in general, having them address issues that we don't need an armed law enforcement officer to address.
Okay, that is helpful, especially as our board is looking to the future of how we operate with lesser of us, and how we have our own staffers potentially to work out in the community. I think continuing that conversation with us would be really key as well. Yeah. And I would love at some point, I was just doing a quick dive into the risk terrain modeling, and I have a whole bunch of questions about that, and that is probably could be its own meeting really to kind of dive into that. It looks really interesting to me, and it looks like the type of recommendations that we that could be really helpful. And so maybe that's fodder for its own meeting or a side conversation. But yeah, definitely utilizing data. I think to me, the key is combining all of the sources of data that we have in the community, right? We as alderpersons know what people call us about, what we see in our wards, what our experience has been. We have, our citizenry has information, our police have information, our NISs have information, and getting all of that data into one place just seems like then helps us better make decisions. As we're talking about redevelopment funds, we're talking about how to best make our decisions, and frankly getting the most information we can about areas that we need to target and how to target them and how to bring in the community to make those decisions. That frankly is really exciting to me. So thank you for this. This is a lot to digest, and I am glad that you all are continuing to be around, because I think we have a lot more work to do. And I love the idea of a committee of a whole. I'm just going to drop that note in there for our public safety chair and vice chair. Thank you for allowing those of us who are not on the committee to speak, because I think this affects us all so deeply.
And I agree. And as always, the public safety meetings are always open to everyone. We go through the committee first, and then but absolutely all input, especially when it comes to this, because it's going to get interesting, because out of this, we will come up with some sort of ordinances, I'm sure. Vice Chair, are you sure? Are you done, Alderwoman Rice?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much.
Vice Chairman Boyd, you're back up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have some follow-up questions. Out of curiosity, and you don't have to go into it in detail, it may be another conversation, but have you guys looked into aerial surveillance and whether it has a negative or positive impact on communities across the country? Anybody?
Sorry, I had trouble finding the mute button. Even after 2 years of Zoom, I still have trouble with that mute button. So the general use of aerial surveillance is not something that we would typically recommend in a community. The idea of surveillance is always a hyper-local question, and what you're trying to solve with that. I would speak that more generally, the use of surveillance is typically used to over-surveil certain people, typically black and brown people, and is typically not focused on the civil liberties issues. But I recognize that everyone has their own decisions to make, but CPE is not likely to have a strong position in favor of surveillance of that kind, of that magnitude in the cities that we are working with.
Okay, to that point, it takes me to the next question. I think I want to, Dr. Kenter, you were a 20-year police officer, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Almost 31 years.
And what community did you represent?
The city of Norfolk in Virginia.
Norfolk, Virginia. And what was the racial makeup for the most part?
Norfolk's about 48% Black, 10% Asian, and the rest a mix of white and non-white people, biracial people. But it's majority. It's a Black majority city. The demographics are very close to St. Louis.
Yeah. And so, how do you reconcile because I hear this, in the Black community, we're over policed, which just disagree until the data supports, otherwise. If you have a 90% Black neighborhood, chances are the majority of the people that you arrest, cite, or whatever, 90% will probably be Black. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's correct, of course.
Okay, so I guess then I would have to see the data where we go jump to the South side, and on the South side, which is, let's say, 90% white, if 90% of people pulled over are Black, then I see that being an issue. But then let's take it a little deeper. So the 90% of people that was Black that was arrested on the South side, did they live on the North side? And is there a correlation? Because I'm not a race-based type person. I will call racism out when I see it, and I see it at the Board of Aldermen sometime, and throughout the city of St. Louis. We're a very racist town. We're probably ranking the top 5 as the most racist city in America. But I understand statistics. I understand data. I understand, research. And you can, if you have a hypothesis and you want it to work out in your favor, then you tend to interpret the data in a way that supports your theory. Would I be wrong with that?
I'm not quite sure what your question is. Are you asking if so oftentimes people manipulate their data to support their hypotheses?
Well, they look at the data and in a way that pretty much supports their hypothesis.
I don't agree with that. A true scientist,
okay,
lets the data speak for themselves.
Okay, so my point is, when I'm trying to save a Black community, and then people tell me I'm over, we're over policed over here, but we have people that are frightened and afraid to call the police, and they're asking for additional resources like the cameras and what have you in order to make them feel safe. If you're in a 90% Black community, the majority of your arrests are going to be of Black people. That's not like that would just be common sense. But then people want to I think sometimes people lump it all and paint it with one brush and says, oh, wow, there's a disparity in the amount of Black people that are arrested in a particular city compared to white people. But if you're in a city where the majority of the African-American people are in poverty and the majority of the white people are middle class and above, I mean, it's like, okay, that makes sense to me. The majority of the Black people are going to be incarcerated because they're caught up in the cycle of poverty, and they commit most of the crimes. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. Please finish. Go ahead.
And I'm not trying to say that I'm so pro locking up Black people. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just trying to interpret data. Right. I'm just trying to look at, from a common sense approach without minimizing common sense, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you, and I appreciate the question. So first, I think it's important to highlight the idea of a disparity, the proportion of people in a city, right? So what we would expect just on the pure science is that what the number of people that make up a population are also represented around other issues, right? And in this case, we talked about car stops, pedestrian stops, and use of force. And what we found is that although Black people are only 47.5% of your city, they're making up around 65% of the people stopped. The people that are stopping, they're stopped while driving their vehicle, right? Now, conversely, white people are 42% of the city, but they're stopped at 32% of the time. So the idea of proportionality, as you referenced, if it's 90% is considered, and there is a disproportionate number of arrests, car stops, and pedestrian stops, and these are just police actions. How often I am interacting with you to stop you as a pedestrian or a driver, or to use force on you. And so that is generally an indicator of bias. And I'll say that it isn't a straight analysis, right? We do what's called a regression analysis that accounts for the issues that you referenced, both crime and poverty. And so there are efforts to account for what you're saying, and disproportionate police contact, again, in car stops, use of force and pedestrian stops is still present. So I hear what you're saying on a neighborhood level, on a citywide level. What we're talking about is a disproportionate issue, right? Now, what we're suggesting here is that there are portions of all disparities that are and are not owned by the police department. In this case, we highlighted the area that we believe is owned or it can be explained by either police policy, police operations, or police practice. And that is what we're trying to state here. And I don't know that our report used the phrase over policing, but certainly if there's a burden of policing, it's being disproportionately felt and received by Black people in your city. And that's just the science that we highlighted there.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Manos. Is it Manos? I'm gonna make sure. Manos. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you think sometimes it's a cultural issue on how we engage with the police and how the police engage with the community?
So are you referring to police culture?
No, not just the police, Black culture.
Okay.
Black culture as well as police culture.
So one of the councilmen, and I'm forgetting who now, maybe Councilman Bosley, but referenced a significant history of policing in this country that goes back to slavery, right?
Mm-hmm.
But talked about the oppression that people have received. So what I will and have argued is that it is entirely reasonable for Black people in this country, particularly Black people in our cities, to have some misgivings around policing. It would actually be unreasonable to expect folks after many years of having some police oppression, police that were that they did not feel were there to protect them, and all evidence to their experience was that police were not there to protect them. All of their upbringing, for instance, might have said the police are folks that have historically harmed our community with real data and numbers behind it to distrust police. So I don't know particularly about each interaction, but by and large, it is a reasonable reaction for people in predominantly Black communities or Black people in general to say, you know, the police have been a problem for me and for my community in the past and have treated us unjustly, have been the agents of segregation, have been the agents of slavery, have been the agents of stop and frisk, and have been the folks who have caused us harm. That to me is a reasonable, historically based and scientific response from community.
I agree. I think the African American community have every reason to mistrust the police, and we're angry. And I think we're in a culture now with the newer generation that they're challenging those methods that the police use to communicate and deal with African American people. And I say that, and I bring culture up because I'm just wondering if anyone has really done any research and study, because I'm going to give you a real world example. See, if you pulled over by the police and you're a Black man, you would never get out the car. Okay, you are taught to make sure you got your driver license and your insurance, and when the officer approaches, you just ready to give. Okay, you would never get out the car. But we had an incident where, you know, I hope the chairman don't mind me sharing it, but the chairman was pulled over by the police and got out the car, and he wasn't shot. He wasn't shot and killed. But if a Black person had got out that car, the likelihood of that person having excessive force used on them would probably be highly likely. And that's what I mean about some cultural differences about the interaction with police based on how white people pulled over and dealt with and how Black people pulled over and dealt with. And I don't know if you guys have done research and taken into consideration, but I think some of that cultural upbringing has something to do with why African Americans are disproportionately mistreated in traffic stops, because we do want to, you know, be treated fairly, and we want to exercise our rights, and sometimes our rights are violated. So maybe I'm just giving a commentary, but I just wonder sometimes if when you do your regression analysis, is all that kind of stuff taken into consideration?
I think the science is pretty clear on that the police don't have the same amount of trust and legitimacy in historic Black neighborhoods than they do in white neighborhoods. There's also some pretty good signs that there's an assumption of criminality with Black people that the police have. Immediately assume that there's some kind of criminality involved. That science is really clear in the social psychology world. So yeah, so if you look at the data we have in St. Louis, a great deal in the north part of the city, a great deal of those use of force starts with low-level interactions, right? And that indicates to me that there's not a lot of trust and legitimacy in the police. People probably have been stopped over and over again on their front stoop. And those low-level interactions turn into a use of force, or what we call contempt of cop, leave me alone. No, I said, come here, give me your ID. You know how it goes. You've seen it 100 times, right?
Hey,
So I think the data is pretty clear there.
I've been handcuffed and brought by the police a couple times, so I know how it works. So anyway, I'm curious as to some of the data and feedback that you guys received. Did you see any disparity into the racial makeup or the socioeconomic status of the people who gave feedback?
So our efforts were to engage as many people that were willing to engage with us as possible. So for the most part, I think this might be answering your question. We were engaging with advocacy groups and their members, and folks that were interested in this space. Our next work will be to do as much grassroots or frontline interviews as possible. So while the racial makeup was certainly diverse, if anything, we probably oversampled purposefully of Black people and advocacy groups in that space. The economic makeup, in other words, folks that may not have, frankly, the time to be and the reach to be engaged in some of these other efforts, were not necessarily there. I will say that the folks that we did interview did spend a lot of time asking a similar question. All right, so they were both simultaneously advocates for police reform and advocates for people and poor Black people. Okay.
You had mentioned something about the public has a right to know if they're being surveillanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me ask you, is that a law or just a good practice?
Well, in some level, in some states, depending on the surveillance, there are recording laws, for instance, so you have a right to know when you're being recorded in private. But certainly, I'm talking about public surveillance, right? And so that is not a law. That is something that we recommend that folks be given the access to when they are being surveilled. They're notified, so to speak. It's not a law that I'm aware of, but I can't really speak to Missouri state law.
And only reason I bring that up is Ring cameras, because this is a highly debated issue when it comes to surveillance the public.
It sure
and
is.
I have not been convinced that cameras in the public right away is a violation of anybody's rights, because people that have Ring doorbells can see they can actually track when their neighbor comes home, leaves home, who they're with, so on and so forth. And there's no requirement for them to notify anybody, put a sign in the yard that I have a Ring doorbell, to protect people from doing mischievous deeds. So I'm always perplexed about the argument about, well, if it's the government, then the government shall not. But if you're a private citizen, then you shall have the opportunity.
Yeah, you said it right. It's absolutely complicated. And I don't think we're gonna hash it out right now.
No, we're not. I'm giving commentary. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'll just say quickly, the idea is that if I have a Ring doorbell camera, there's very little I can do to effectuate harm on my neighbor. When the government does, there's quite a bit they can do to effectuate harm. So the downstream consequences of my camera is significantly different than the downstream consequences of the government's camera.
Well, let me ask you this, Doc. If my camera is used, to support a crime that it captured on camera, then the government has access to it. If they ask me for it, I'm going to give it. If they subpoena me for it, I'm going to give it, right? So what difference does it make who owns the camera?
As you said, it's a complicated issue. I think for people, it's that idea that the government is surveilling them. It has had consequences for people. The idea that they're being watched people feel like, you mentioned rights. I think you're probably referencing civil rights or the rights that are embedded in law. There are a lot of people that talk about their rights in more of a human rights context and believe that their movement should not be regulated by the government, and do see a difference between the government accessing someone's footage and the government owning it. I hear what you're saying. It seems like a fine line, maybe like splitting hairs, but I don't want to speak for people, but it is that idea that your presence and your movement is being monitored and regulated via technology that is certainly a UN definition of human rights issue.
And in this culture today, I mean, shoot, everybody's video taping everybody. Then they're putting it on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and my God, they can show the world 1 million times over, more so than the government would ever do. The government is not going to put your stuff on Facebook and Instagram and all that. They're just going to use it for investigative measures. Whereas people that use these smartphones to capture as much video as they can, they want to be world known, recognized, make money off of it, and all kind of crazy. But it is complicated. I just wanted to throw that out there just for conversation, because it just seems like, oh man, we do this report and we think these are great measures that we should do, these things that we shouldn't do, but there's a reason we do them, because they make people feel safe. And sometimes the fact that you make people feel safe, even though they may not necessarily be based on the data, right? Their peace of mind is priceless. And I'm gonna leave it with that.
I appreciate you.
Thank you.
I will make a comment real fast. First off, I didn't know I was not supposed to get out of the car. Secondly, I guess I'm glad I didn't get shot.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I have to interrupt.
I didn't know.
That's the cultural issue that I
didn't realize. I think that one of the questions I think we may want them to, not about getting shot or not getting shot. It's something I just never heard of, because being pulled over for the first time and the officer taking a certain amount of time, I was wondering, I was asking Greg, my friend, am I supposed to go back there? And I was unsure what to do. I know now, don't get out of the car. And I'm told by the mayor's dad, who said if I was black, I would have been shot. I don't know. I don't know that. But what I will say on a serious note, that maybe one of the statistics that we should get from the police are on the car stops, what percent are white, what percent are black, what minority they're broken into, in what areas they're coming from. Because I agree with you, if the majority of the people being pulled over on the highway in the south part of the city are black, there could be an issue. So I don't see why we wouldn't want to know that. I mean, as far as disparity, I never did argue about being pulled over and getting a ticket. I did argue about getting coughed on and was exposed to COVID, but that's a whole new subject. But I really think that might be something that we should bring up, is as they're pulling people over, because I understand what you were saying earlier, black and white crime, but now we're talking about people that are just driving down the road. Are they being randomly pulled over? Maybe we need to get that. And I see that, let's see. Anyway, is anyone else on the committee or off the committee have any other questions for Dr. Hunt and Dr. Robert? Having seen that, nobody else. First off, I appreciate you.
No, I raised my hand.
Oh, I don't see your picture or your hand. I'm sorry. Brandon, Alderman Bosley, come on back. There you are. Okay, thank you.
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say this real quick. So look, realistically, right? The police are not over here like harassing like single mothers and folks that aren't doing anything. I just want to say that I don't want to make it seem like they out here and like you see, somebody and you just pull them over and get to like bother them. That is not like a common thing. I'm not going to say that does not happen, but I would say particularly in, in areas that are high crime, police will pull you over and tell you flat out they're looking for guns and drugs. And depending on what type of drugs you got in the car, they'll let you go. And they'll tell you, hey, they'll let you know you got a warrant. So, I'm not going to be impartial about. Let me say and just be realistic. I'm for what's right, and I want to make sure that when our officers are doing particular things that we need to look into, those are realistic things we need to spend time on. I think the disparities in between what goes on in communities, especially ones that are high crime, we don't have a whole lot of white people that live in our communities. So if you're going to search in my community in general on how many white folks get pulled over, you're going to immediately see that it's a whole lot of more black folks than white folks, because white people not coming down here, and the ones that do live here aren't normally having interactions with the police. We have some that do, but and that's why if you look at the statistics, it's going to be primarily black. If you look at the statistics in the neighborhood, the demographics here, it is primarily black. So I don't think people are getting. I'm not going to say there isn't racial profiling going on, because that'd be a lie if I said there was not some taking place. Definitely is. But I will say that for most of the officers here in some of these areas, as long as you aren't an individual of interest and they don't think you're somebody who is possibly doing something, most of the time they'll let you go. And that's one of the reasons why people are comfortable driving around with their tags. 2 years, people wouldn't drive around with the tags like that, and then the police officers won't get you. Like, generally, you do that in areas where you can get away with it, and they get away with it in the city because they know they can. Most officers really looking for guns and drugs, and they're trying to stop like the violent crimes, and that's what these officers are generally working towards. I don't think they're out here just working on trying to pull over, single mothers or even fathers, whoever it is. Whatever's going on, unless you're doing something, they're not really trying to mess with you. That's not their goals, because they got bigger things going on. Who wants to write up a...
We Alderman Bosley, we lost you again there. Alderman Bosley, we lost you.
I'm sorry, I'm back. My apologies. Yeah, so I will say they definitely pick and choose when and who they pull over. Is it happening again? Okay, yeah, they definitely pick and choose the individuals they pull over. So I will say that. The other thing I wanted to ask and add, are you all suggesting that we need some type of a de-escalation unit for the police department?
So the police department does have de-escalation training, and I don't know, and they have a CIT training. So I don't know that we would ever say that's not a good idea to firm that up, to continue to do that, continue to make efforts around de-escalation. The issue is that, and now we're speaking about St. Louis and the rest of the country, that de-escalation training itself is not enough to constrain police behavior, and that what is also needed is reforms around policy and more significant oversight. So certainly de-escalation will never hurt, but it cannot be the sole solution to things like disparities and to things like use of force, because of the other things that are driving it. It just needs to be part of that, of the solution, not the sole solution, which often it's been framed as the sole solution.
Right, but it's definitely, how much of the solution would you say it holds a part of? Because I would say in every single part of law enforcement, when it comes down to trust and building bridges at this point, there will be some point of de-escalation that's needed, because de-escalation is what it is that we're trying to get away from, and trying to figure out how to mitigate the most escalated situations and turn them into de-escalated situations. So, how much of a percentage do you think de-escalation plays a part in what it is that we're trying to figure out how to reform?
Yeah, so I think as I noted, right. So if we're talking about disparities, is that what we're talking about, how to lower disparities?
So everything in general, because after we get finished with disparities, law enforcement is a problem in general in building these bridges, even outside of disparities. People that are affluent, folks that make millions of dollars a year that are Black, drive through their own neighborhoods where they live and still get profiled by the police. So it doesn't matter what caliber of finances you make, or what type of a person you are, what type of job you got. Being Black in America with law enforcement is a history of you feeling some type of threatened. So, you feeling threatened at some point in time, no matter where it is. I don't know, hell, you could be, Mr. Stewart, $1 billion man. And if you go into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, you could feel yourself looking around, making sure that, that the law enforcement know, hey, I miss, who I am. So I just want to make sure that once again, we're looking at the pieces after it is that we kind of figure out specifically how to address our needs here specifically in the city. There is that just not a poverty piece, because everybody in my neighborhood, I love my people today. Everybody don't even living in poverty just because we live in an impoverished neighborhood. There's folks out here we got Black millionaires in our ward that's doing absolutely well. We have white millionaires in our ward that's doing absolutely well. And we got people that's making, $13,000 to $17,000 a year trying to figure it out. So it's a plethora of individuals, and we all are affected by, living in these impoverished neighborhoods. So the point is, even after getting across that poverty barrier, is de-escalation something that plays a pivotal point in law enforcement and building the bridges in community and this system in general, and how much of a place does it actually, how much of a part does it actually play? Because I think de-escalation plays a really big part in everything. I actually have a de-escalation bill, which is the reason why I brought that up. And it's called a minority de-escalation unit that I believe would be very, very helpful. And when individuals like you have right here in your PowerPoint, where police officers don't really need to be called, there's not just a non-violent thing going on, somebody may be high, there's someone that needs to have the ability to go and de-escalate that situation, and the officers can go deal with a more serious or violent situation. Therefore, that individual isn't subject to the same energy that officer is giving off after he wouldn't dealt with a homicide or something like that. This person is just irate. They may be on drugs, and person who deals with individuals like that on a regular basis, like you said, from parking enforcement, people who are irate, just working, so individuals have the ability to de-escalate a lot of situations, I believe, in this city, as you all noted. So would it be, I would say, a good idea for our city to invest in a de-escalation unit that solely focuses on de-escalating situations like you have there in your PowerPoint, and we have a designated account for it? Would you be willing to work with, us in coming up with some type of criteria on how that de-escalation unit could work with the St. Louis Police Department, Board of Aldermen? My suggestion is they go through the health department, because that's, de-escalation comes from a mental standpoint. That it's not physical. You have to get in a person's mind, and that comes down to health. You have to understand what a person's going through.
Thank you for clarifying what you meant by de-escalation unit. I think that's very helpful for the response. So I do think that, that is a different model than we've described for sure, but certainly present in some of the violent interruption models, right? So these credible messengers that are there to address violence and try and stem violence before it gets retaliated or before it occurs. So what you're describing, I think, exists in some form. I think we'd obviously need to hear more, but any of these responses that are not designed to reduce, they're not designed to solve problems through arrest or through police use of force, is something that I think is worthwhile to discuss, kick around and discuss more. And certainly, as I mentioned, some of these violent interruption models seem to be similar to what you're describing. I don't know exactly what your bill looks like. I'd be happy to read it, but I'm hearing some similar tones.
Understood. I think they're very similar, which is why I brought it up. So I definitely would like to reach out to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you, and I appreciate you. No further comments, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Boyd, I see there. Any questions? Anybody else on or off the committee? I'm trying to look. I don't see any raised hands. So Dr. Robert and Dr. Hans, thank you guys so much. I'm sure we'll be asking you back here in next week as we work through some of this. Other than that, I guess if we just need a motion to adjourn and we can.
I move to adjourn.
So thank you all for having us. I'm going to go ahead and drop my email in the host and panelist chat. Feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions or anything else that you want to share with us. I'll also drop Rob's. So if you want to email us both, you can. And just let us know if you need anything. We're happy to support at any time. And thank you again for offering us this time to discuss this.
Okay, and I'll give everybody a minute to copy that down in the chat, and then I think we'll and thank you guys for being here. Hopefully everybody can write down their information in the chat. And having, I guess everybody hopefully has done that. So Vice Chairman Boyd, you made a motion to adjourn. Do we have a second on that motion? Are we all staying here?
How about you second? And then
I'm gonna have to, it seems. So I will second that motion. I think what happens, a lot of people have dropped off. Anyway, I'll second that. And so we'll just adjourn
We'll adjourn.
until next week.